Welcome to Reading Tasks. Today we're going to move on and elaborate the next step, and in some sense a more elaborate step in my process of slowly getting to know a poem. I have up my notes here for describing form and figure in Donica Kelly's Brood, one of the example poems I've been using for these elaboration videos. Um, if you didn't watch it, I do have a separate video where I define what I mean by the word form, a word that floats around in literary studies, is used by almost every literary critic, and sometimes has a different meaning depending on who you're reading. So I have a pretty general definition, wide open definition of it. And in the case of Kelly's poem, by form, I'm particularly interested in the shape and arrangement of the poem, as well as the relation of the parts of the poem to each other, as well as any features of the poem that seem to have a specific function beyond just being a word that has a meaning or a connotation to it. So, in the case of Kelly's poem, and its shape and arrangement. I think one of the things that stands out most to me is Kelly's use of white space and how white space fills the page and screen. This is not unrelated to her use of one and two word lines in the poem and her use of spacing. In addition to that, this is related also to the white space, the use of indentation that varies and scrambles, at least my sense of line and stanza breaks. If you may recall from earlier videos where I mentioned that the bean counting phase of Kelly's poem would be particularly challenging because there doesn't initially seem to be stanzas at all, or if there are, they are single line stanzas, maybe. The stanzas are a little easier to make out in the version that's published in the 2025 collection, The Natural Order of Things. But but in this edition that's on poets.org, it's probably not worth worrying so much about the stanza organization. Anyway, that's part of the bean counting phase, but you can tell that when I get to the form phase, I start to think about the significance of some of those decisions, or at least try to dive a little deeper. I then, as I was thinking more about what to make of the use of indentation, the arrangement of lines on the page, I also started to think about, and this might become more obvious if you zoom out a bit, the way in which the poem also looks a little jagged. The lines reaching to the right margin, starting with line one on the left margin, getting over to getting over here. Uh, Sorry, I clicked away from this for a second. Getting over here to line four, moving back by line five, moving back to the right margin here. You get a sense of a kind of jaggedness, the lines reaching toward the right margin, retreating from the left margin before returning back. And it sort of, as I put in my notes here, seems to be giving giving heart monitor or a kind of irregular beat, but sort of reoriented vertically. And at first time, I didn't think this necessarily mattered until it occurred to me that heart monitors have a kind of rhythm to them. That when we're talking about heartbeat, and the poem itself mentions heartbeat, we're thinking about rhythm. Now, this is not to say that the poem is organized to look like a heart monitor. That's not my point, but that there's maybe a accidental resonance there that does seem worth at least keeping in mind, and it helps me kind of wrap my head around the kind of arrangement of the poem itself. That the poem, the arrangement of the lines on the page, is doing a kind of work um, beyond just uh, existing, beyond just existing on the page. Okay, so relation of parts. The one thing that sort of occurred to me here was that the italicized words and phrases in the poem express something written or meant that corrects other words or phrases or is corrected by other words and phrases. This dynamic, which I've mentioned in previous videos, does seem sort of at the center of what the poem, how the poem itself functions, that lines speak to each other and actually correct each other, amplify the meaning of each other more explicitly than they do sometimes in other poems. It's a kind of principle of close reading that the meaning of any given line or any given image is pressured by or amplified by or affected by other parts of the poem. And Kelly sort of brings that to the surface explicitly by having a speaker say, I meant to write this after giving us line one. And it makes us kind of wonder what the similarity, overlap, difference is between my chest is earth and my chest is warm, or what the difference might be between beat and breathe, but also the similarity or the accidental meanings that kind of emerge when we swap those words out for each other. I did notice though, as I was reading and rereading this, that the dynamic the poem sets up here that I've just been describing does start to change. So at the very end of the poem, you don't really have these one-to-one words like dirt and dearth, kind of one replacing the other or affecting the other. Instead, as the poem is coming to its end, you have this kind of repetition, anaphoric repetition. I mean. And each of these rephrasings, it's a little unclear what they are meant to be replacing or what they are meant to be affecting or amplifying. And so, whereas earlier you have, a kind of sonic blip or slide connecting those things, you have instead a sort of full substitution here, right? For months at rest in the hole, I'd made in myself a frozen ground, a ground in thaw. I mean, spring is coming. It's just kind of unclear, you know. Sorry, it's a little unclear what spring is coming is meant to replace. Maybe a ground in thaw, a frozen ground, a ground in thaw. I mean, spring is coming. I mean, I push the wet dirt with my mandible. I mean, jaw. So here, jaw is potentially replaces mandible, and it's a little unclear why that slide. Maybe because we tend not to talk about human mandibles, but talk about jaws, whereas mandible might be something we associate more with insects or cicadas. I'm not sure. All right, let's move that up over there, move my head and floating head up here. Let's go back to where I was. Okay, so those are some of my notes about how form is working. White space, the use of single word or two word lines, indentation, those are all working together to kind of create the sort of spread out feeling of the poem, but it's not necessarily spread out super wide, but just enough to give that sense of something that's kind of digging its way to the right margin before going back, and then digging its way to the right margin before coming back. All right. When it comes to figures of speech, the figures of speech I sometimes have in mind, or usually have in mind when I get to taking notes about this portion of the poem, or the kind of descriptive notes that I try to take, are usually limited to things like metaphor and metonymy. Though I should say, other instances of figurative language that I sometimes also look at, apostrophe being one, hyperbole, of course, irony, there's metaphor and metonymy, personification, synecdoche is a kind of metonymy, or at least that's how I think of it. These are the kinds of the uses of figurative language that I tend to look at, and I'll try to link some of these definitions of these figures of speech in the video description if folks don't have time to pause and look at those definitions. Um, so figuration in this poem sort of is signaled right away in the poem, um, and right away in the title. Now, I say that because if you read the title and then read the first few lines, it's not entirely clear what that connection is, and so it's pretty safe to say that the title has a kind of figurative resonance with something else that's going on in the poem. And as I say in my notes here, which I might make a little bigger, the title does connect up with some of these other terms that seem related to subterranean insect life or subterranean cicada life. Although, as I've also mentioned, I think, or teased in the past, it completely went over my head that cicadas were the primary kind of framing figure or metaphor for this poem. And I was totally confused, especially by the reference to nymph at the very end, until I looked up the word and saw that one of the dictionary definitions relates to the development of insect life. Um, Other notes that I took as I was thinking more about the poem and about the significance of this figurative frame, um, that the imagery of living underground, the cicada sort of taps into that, a sort of period of long subterranean life, a period of waiting, of brewing, sort of brooding maybe. So brood in that sense has a couple different potential meanings there, a brood of cicada, but also brooding as a kind of reflective, meditative um, state, which is necessarily a positive one, but the poem itself, it isn't necessarily clear what sort of mood it is narrated in, especially here at the end. But would you please explain this half remembered light? Um, has that kind of attitude of a potential brooding. Anyway, the imagery of living underground does organize the poem and its meanings. All of the moments where the poem coming back to the lines that correct each other or refer to the difference between what has been said or written and what was meant. All of that is kind of organized around imagery of being underground, pressuring repeated references to writing, to speaking, to meaning, to revising. Um, uh, and that the use of language, choosing to start expressing oneself in language, correcting oneself with language, is in that sense tantamount to sort of digging oneself or digging one's heart right out of the ground. Um, using whatever means are possible there, and then the reference to the jaw then is both a reference to, of course, how cicadas dig themselves up using their front claws, their front legs, and I think their mouth. What do I know about insect life? But the use of the mouth here is in the speaking, in the reciting, in the poetry making, right? Um, and the coming to life, it's a little unclear if that's a reference to sort of reconnecting through the poetic voice, coming to light sort of as a kind of preparation for the writing of more poems. It's a little unclear, to me at the moment anyway, exactly what to make of it. And I don't, because I'm not probably going to write or publish anything about this poem, I don't need to. But I do, I'm pretty happy with where I've come to, or the spot I've gotten to with respect to the connection or the relevance of how the poem ends to the rest of what's going on. It's also maybe significant to remind you that this poem is a kind of prologue. It's positioned not just first, but as a kind of prologue or a preface or an introductory poem to the collection, The Natural Order of Things. And I think that positioning of the poem there also sort of amplifies how I'm thinking about it as a kind of opening up of a new collection, a new and recent collection. Okay, well, what about just take a few minutes to think about how I would describe the form and figures in Sonnet 9. Um, it's word because this is a sonnet. I went back and there was a reason I went back because it's a sonnet, and the form, to describe the form of a sonnet, means having to think about things that I've already taken notes on. I thought this was a good time to remind you that these steps of the steps in getting to know a poem connect to each other and sometimes repeat each other and um, concern features that have already been commented on. So, for instance, when talking about the form of a sonnet, you have to address, how many lines there are. In identifying it as a sonnet, you have something to say about how many lines are in the poem because most sonnets are 14 lines. Um, Notes about enjambment are largely um, going to be a concern as well. If and when listening for sound and sense, the rhymed words are part of the rhyme scheme. That again is part of a traditional sonnet. So I think that's those are. So this is just to say that some notes I've already taken in previous phases of getting to know this sonnet anticipate or already speak to description of the poem's form in the sense of thinking about the form as the genre of the sonnet itself. Some things I might not have referenced earlier, though, and that I only really started to track in hindsight, looking back at, say, the pronouns that the poem uses, um, but then also thinking about its use of direct address. I I started to think a little bit more about how sonnets are intended to also make arguments, right? And so one thing that came to mind for me on rereading this the I don't know 10th time this week, maybe more, is that we get direct address to we might call him the beloved in the poem, to thou, to you, to thy. Um, is it for fear to wet a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? Right. We have several references to thou, to thee, but those stop in line 7. From line 7 to the end of the poem, the speaker does not directly address the beloved, but instead starts to speak about him in general terms or or in the third person. So in that sense, the argument works, or the sonnet works as sonnet, not just because the speaker directly addresses a beloved, but the sonnet seems capable of staging an argument, a scene of argument, where the speaker um, sorry, I forgot to put my phone on do not disturb, where the speaker either addresses a third person or audience or imagines that they are in order to rhetorically amplify or ironically twist the argument delivered, right? Um, so you can imagine, I mean, imagine, for instance, you're in a fight with a friend or with a significant other, and someone walks by who hasn't even been part of the conversation. You turn to them and you say, "Can you believe this?" or something like that. Um, or imagine you're in an argument with someone and you start to speak about them in the third person while they're in the room. In some sense, maybe talking to yourself in front of them about what they're up to. You can imagine how potentially aggravating that could be, right? It's a provocation. It's a provocation to the person that is potentially mean spirited, as opposed as is mean spirited that's intended to kind of twist a knife, as opposed to being a genuine effort to persuade, right? So I hope that makes sense. So this is me sort of thinking about again the description of the form of the poem and how it functions as a sonnet, as an argument, um, and and in that sense, we can also think about how the rhymed words also frame and structure those turns and twists, right? I mean, just glancing at this list of rhymed words: I die, life, wife, weep, keep, behind, mind, spend, and it sits, commits. You can see how all of that orchestrates and organizes, um, in addition to the quatrain structure and couplet structure of the sonnet, the delivery of this argument, and as a container for this shift of direct address, of from the direct address to the beloved, right, getting them to wonder something about themselves, and then the kind of provocative pivot to talking about them in the third person, either to someone else who is present or to themselves, or as a way to kind of provoke or aggravate the beloved. Um, as we'll talk about maybe when we get to ideas and questions, sometimes Shakespeareans or readers of Shakespeare will kind of evaluate or judge the quality of the argument given. Is this really persuasive or not? That seems to me to though to miss the point of what the sonnet is and what it's up to. But I'll come back to that in the next video or in a video in the near future. So what about figurative language? What's kind of going on here? I mean, the primary, um, I guess the primary figure here is, what? How could we describe it? There's a kind of comparison of the world, a metaphorical comparison of the world to an imagined widow, right? Um, a comparison of, um, or a sort of metonymic substitution of the beloved for a shape, a form, a child, right? A child that kind of repeats them. This I also this poem, reading it now after doing a video on a very contemporary poem called Mise en Abîme, made me think about how that the use of that figure in that poem, which was used to kind of frame and amplify a father-daughter relationship or a father-child relationship, reminded me of this moment where Shakespeare, all the way back to Shakespeare, Shakespeare's thinking about children as a kind of copy of an original, sort of set in the life of the original, so as a kind of mise en abîme. This makes me also think of Plath's, that great tercet in Plath about the cloud distilling a mirror to watch its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. So anyway, long history of thinking of the mise en abîme, the language of the copy of the image as a way to think about generational relationships. Um, so we have these. Let's go back through the poem and sort of think about this a little bit. Is it for fear to wet a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? Ah, if issueless shalt hap to die, the world will wail thee like a makeless wife. There's that sort of simile of the world and a wife or a widow. The world will be thy widow, and still weep that thou no form of thee hast left behind, when every private widow well may keep by children's eyes her husband's shape in mind. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spend, shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end, and kept unused the user so destroys it. No love toward others in that bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. So in addition to the primary metaphor and metonymies of the poem, the world and the widow, the substitution of the beloved for a shape, a form, an issue, a child, um, child, or the children's eyes, as the poet puts it, you also have a kind of hyperbole. Hyperbole, um, the exaggerated amplification of staying single, staying single to to suicide, uh, to murder, to murder, um, to being a kind of um, to suicide, to murder, to a kind of selfish expenditure, right? A sort of expenditure of a life, right? Being unthrifty with one's use of life, enjoying it while it lasts, but it and not doing anything to make sure it lives beyond you. It kind of becomes a kind of shameful activity. Um, there's something about beauty too. Beauty's waste hath in the world an end, but I guess that isn't necessarily a figure of speech so much. Um, but it's a beauty. I mean, there's a way in which we could think of beauty as metonymy, right? Um, for good looks, um, for pleasing presence, um, for sexual energy, right? Beauty becomes a kind of catch-all word, a sort of stand-in for something about the beloved that the speaker wants to continue to enjoy, right? Um, and I think that's maybe worth sort of thinking about, though I would want to read the other sonnets that are around it. We'll get back to that when we worry about context in a future video. Um, and I sort of wonder to what degree the world and the widow are also a substitute or an amplification of the poet's or the speaker's own desire, right? That it's, I mean, to some degree it's the speaker that maybe wants this for the youth, for the young beloved, though it's maybe a little unclear why. Okay, I think there's probably a lot more to say about what Shakespeare's up to here, but in terms of figurative language, but also form. But I've been going for nearly half an hour, so that's probably enough for now. I think next up, either another short video we'll see, or I'll move on to the next phase of my um, process of slow reading, which is sketching, I think, sketching ideas and questions. And I'll report on some of the ideas and questions I have about Shakespeare's sonnets. And maybe we'll loop back to look at Plath or Tennyson. We'll see. Anyway, hope you read some poems today, and see you tomorrow.